been a marvelous smorgasbord, if you will, of ideas, opinions, and assessments of what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, if you're on the last panel and you sat here all day and you listened to what everybody else said, you throw out your speech and start again, which is what I will do. What I'm going to focus on is my particular strength, which is institutional finance. And the thing I want to bring into this is what has been in my mind missing all day. Don't you understand about global finance? Don't you really understand what goes on in the external markets, what these institutions do, and the games that they play, and, well, you see what's happening with Greece. So you can read about it every day in your newspaper. But I'd like to go back in time and say the seeds of this crisis really were planted in the 1960s. At that time, the central banks of the major industrial countries decided that it was quite all right if their banks were allowed to have operations in a market outside of their countries where there were no rules, no regulations, where it became the Wild West, if you will. They thought it would have no effect. Of course, it ended up having an enormous effect. And so at the very end of the 1960s, when we were sitting here with our golden era in the United States, very much of it resting on very strong regulatory situations, one of which, of course, was ceilings on interest rates for banks and other depository institutions. Along comes a situation in which the Federal Reserve tries to tighten, and the external banks, the banks, U.S., but other foreign banks as well, begin to bring money into the United States because they could get it at the higher interest rate. And they thwarted the Fed, and they drove the Fed to the point where interest rates reached actually 7.5%, a prime rate. At that time, it doesn't sound like so much now. Well, yes, it does now. But that was unheard of, historically unheard of. So we had the beginning then of a situation in which deregulation began with the attack on this critical regulatory tool, which was used throughout the developed countries, the ceilings on interest rates. Now, with that inflow of money in the 60s, it exacerbated the problems with the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system, as we all know, collapsed. And in 1971, the collapse was very real. What this then meant was we privatized the international payment system. It went from being a matter of central banks dealing with these issues to being the private sector taking over. And then what happened, what they really wanted, was the private sector, speculation began. The initial speculation, the game was played with currencies. And it was an amazing game that took place. The countries that were involved responded, obviously. And in 1971 alone, when the dollar was so under attack, you had a situation in which there was a 65% increase in global reserves, all of it in the developed world, none of it in the periphery at that time. Now, that, of course, was the beginning of the procyclicality in policy, because what these central banks did not understand was they were dealing with credit instruments. They weren't holding cash. When they bought the dollars and paid out their own currencies and thought that they were going to get a situation which would raise the value of the dollar, they actually put it into the repatriated it, if you will, to the United States, invested in government securities, and therefore expanded credit in the U.S. Exactly the opposite of effect than the one that they intended to have. So naturally, what happened was there was even more inflation, if you will, in the United States. The 1970s was a decade of inflation. It was driven by intervention in currency markets and investment in the U.S. So what was going on at the time, where was all this money coming from? And so I would like to make the first point about capital running uphill. where was the money coming from? It was coming out of the U.S., and it was round-robining, if you will, or round-tripping, as they called it at the time. And we had such observations as mine stripping in upstate New York, that Chase Manhattan happened to be the bank that got the headlines, if you will, that they were taking the money from the small towns upstate, paying a higher interest rate for it, and then shipping it overseas for the speculative adventures that they were playing. There was a bank in New Orleans that was examined at that time. Half of its deposits were going to Chase Manhattan in New York and then overseas. Now, what happened to that bank and that community? The situation was, of course, there was no lending, therefore the deposits dried up, so eventually the bank failed, and so did the neighborhood. Therefore, the distributional effects were already seen of this global scene that we had there. Toward the end of the decade, the point was made that interest rates rose, and that was before Paul Volcker came on the scene. Obviously, it was nominal interest rates. They did rise because it was an inflationary situation there. Paul Volcker came in, and he made those high interest rates real because he took away the funding for the banks. It made it impossible for them to get it. So suddenly, we're dealing with real interest rates above 10%, not just nominal rates at 20%. We had at the situation, as we all know as well, because of the oil price increase and the need to recycle money. Again, this was taken on by the private sector and done very badly. It was put out to the developing countries. They were to be the locomotives of the global economy. And we have the phenomena then of the other point of our financial crisis routine that goes on through until the present, which is the creation of unsustainable debt. And once that debt was perceived, and was in reality, in the case of Mexico, unsustainable because you couldn't service it, then of course came the collapse. We spoke then of the situation as a problem of the developing countries. It was also very much a problem of the major American banks, 9 of whom, if in fact these countries did not continue to service their debt, would have become insolvent. So we also have the next phase of the pattern of the crisis. We bail out the financial institutions. And we did that by, in effect, asking, or what happened with those indebted countries was they sent the exports to the developed world and got the money for them, and then sent the money to the developed world to pay off their debts. It was, we called it the lost decade. We saw children malnourished. We saw all the effects of this bad distribution. The Mexican crisis has another interesting phenomenon. Now the United States, at the end of the 1980s, goes into recession. Interest rates go low. This is how the Fed typically deals with a downturn. The money goes out. It's not just the private money, it's also the industrial countries cashing in their reserves because the dollar is now low, or the dollar was high, and now it looks as though they've got to defend their own currencies. And it was the private sector going in and driving up the Mexican stock market 400% in dollar terms. Greenspan raised the interest rate in the U.S. in 1994. The money comes back to the U.S., and we see that Mexico is flat on its face. We bail out Mexico, bail in quotes. We didn't bail out Mexico. We bailed out the speculators. The burden of that lending that was put together by Robert Rubin was in effect borne by the Mexican taxpayer over time and impoverished Mexico. I want to do a few other points here. We talked about NAFTA before. The other point about NAFTA, and I liked very much Eileen's bringing into the situation the idea of how we let the corporations trump the governments through NAFTA. The second part of that story is financial. It was the agreements under NAFTA that in the case of Mexico, they would have to allow foreign banks into their economy